Some stories force us to look directly into the darkest corners of human nature. Others challenge what we think we know about justice, punishment, and the thin line between order and chaos. And today, we're stepping into both. On one side is Tsutomu Miyazaki, a man whose crimes shattered the illusion of safety in suburban Japan, leaving families and investigators face to face with a kind of horror that defies understanding. A predator who hunted innocents and whose name still echoes in the country's collective memory. On the other is Pedro Rodrigues Filho, a man born into violence who grew into something far more complicated. A killer, yes, but one who aimed his rage at other criminals, a vigilante to some, a monster to others, and a reminder that justice can twist into something unrecognizable when the system fails. Two men, two lives shaped by brutality, two endings that couldn't have been more different, and between them lies a question we still struggle to answer. What do we become when justice breaks down? And who steps into the void it leaves behind? I'm Michelle.
And I'm the other guy.
And this is Shifting Veils. This is a story of Tsutomu Miyazaki and Pedro Rodrigues Filho, two paths into darkness and the shadows they left behind.
Tsutomu Miyazaki entered the world already marked as an outsider. Born in Tokyo in 1962, he carried a rare congenital deformity. The bones in his wrists were fused, locking his hands in a downward angle and preventing him from lifting them normally. In another time or place, it might have been a manageable difference, but mid 20th century Japan held rigid expectations, especially for children who didn't fit the mold. Disabilities were often hidden, whispered about, or quietly sent away to institutions. Miyazaki grew up knowing he was different, not just in the way he moved, but in the way people looked at him. That early separation from the world around him didn't create the darkness he would later become known for, but it shaped the isolation that followed him through childhood, adolescence, and beyond. Miyazaki didn't grow up in obscurity. His family carried weight in the community. Generations of relatives had served on the Itsukaichi town council, and his parents owned the local newspaper, a position that came with both money and influence. In a country where children with disabilities were often sent to institutions, that influence likely kept Miyazaki at home rather than hidden away. But being kept at home didn't mean being seen there. His parents were consumed by business, politics, and the social demands that came with their status. And most days, Miyazaki drifted through the house like a quiet shadow, watched over mainly by his elderly grandfather. He preferred it that way. Home, even in its loneliness, was safer than school. School was where his wrist deformity became a spotlight he never asked for. He couldn't run the same games. He couldn't keep pace in class. And children, then, now, and always, know exactly where to strike. His difference made him a target, the teasing, the exclusion, the constant reminder that he didn't fit the shape of the world around him, carved out an isolation that would follow him long after childhood ended.
By the time he finished high school, his path was already narrowing. He ranked 40th out of 56 students, an underachiever in a family that expected more. His dream of becoming an English teacher slipped out of reach when he failed to get into the university he wanted. So he pivoted. Photography became his fallback, a practical skill that could have slotted neatly into the family newspaper business, but he had no interest in stepping into that lineage. His parents saw a future shaped by tradition and responsibility. He saw a future where he was left alone. That quiet refusal, small, almost unremarkable, was one of the first places where his world began to diverge from theirs. Miyazaki wanted one thing above all else: distance, solitude, a life untouched by the expectations that came with his family name. But he had other plans. As their only son, he was expected to inherit the family's responsibilities, step into the newspaper business, and carry their legacy forward. The only person who ever seemed to consider what he wanted was his grandfather, the one steady presence in his life. That anchor vanished in 1988 when his grandfather died. Whatever fragile stability Miyazaki had unraveled, he retreated even further into himself, slipping into isolation and desperation. In a moment that revealed just how distorted his grief had become, he consumed part of his grandfather's ashes. Whether it was a desperate attempt to hold on or a sign of deeper psychological fracture, it marked a clear turning point.
Not long after, his behavior shifted from withdrawn to alarming. His younger sister caught him peering at her through a crack in the bathroom door while she showered. When she confronted him, he lashed out violently. Their mother, already frustrated by his reclusive lifestyle and fixation on anime, demanded he find a job. Instead of responding with words, he attacked her too. These incidents didn't appear out of nowhere. They were the first visible ruptures in a life that had been quietly splintering for years. Then the disappearances began. For a quiet town like Itsukaichi, this was unthinkable. Even now, it's common in Japan for young children to run errands or play outside without constant supervision. In the 1980s, especially in a community where neighbors knew one another by name, the idea that a child could simply vanish wasn't part of anyone's reality. That was about to change. The first was 4-year-old Mari Kono. She had been playing at a friend's house when she accepted a ride from a man she didn't know was a predator. That man was Miyazaki. He drove her out of town and parked in a secluded area. What followed was horrific. Once there, he strangled her and then sexually abused her lifeless body. After photographing Mari's remains, he stripped her naked and brought her clothes home as a twisted memento of his deeds. 2 days later, he returned to the crime scene to sever her limbs, keeping her hands and feet as macabre trophies. The rest of her remains were burned in his furnace. Then came the package. Mari's parents received a box containing some of her teeth, photographs of her clothing, and a chilling note that read, "Mari, bones, cremated, investigate, prove." Was it a confession? A taunt? Or was Miyazaki daring the police to catch him before he escalated even further? Whatever the intention, it was clear the safety Itsukaichi once took for granted had shattered.
A month later, he struck again. 7-year-old Masami Yoshizawa was walking along a rural road when a car slowed beside her. A man behind the wheel offered her a ride, and she accepted, an ordinary act in a community where trust still felt safe. To the same secluded area as Mari Kono, where he carried out the same ritual as he did with his first victim. Her remains were left beneath a bridge, and Miyazaki kept her clothing as another trophy, another sign that he had no intention of stopping.
2 months after Masami's disappearance, Miyazaki targeted a third child. This time there was no pretense of kindness. 4-year-old Erika Namba was walking home from a friend's house when he pulled up beside her. He didn't speak, he didn't coax. He simply grabbed her from the street and forced her into his car. He drove to an empty parking lot, one he knew would be deserted. He photographed her naked before killing her and leaving her body on display at the public location. 3 days later, Erika's remains were found. Her parents were already living through the worst moment of their lives, but the cruelty didn't end there. Days after her discovery, a letter arrived in their mailbox. Words cut from magazines and arranged into a chilling message. Erika, cold, cough, throat, rest, death. It was a taunt, a deliberate twist of the knife, and it made one thing unmistakably clear. Miyazaki wasn't finished.
6 months passed before Miyazaki claimed another child. 5-year-old Ayako Nomoto was playing outside when he approached her with a camera and a simple request. Could he take her picture? She agreed, an innocent decision that placed her directly in his path. She followed him to his car, and he killed her soon after. This time he didn't leave her remains in the open. He placed her body in the trunk and drove home, carrying her into his apartment as if she were something he intended to keep. Over the next 2 days, he sexually violated her corpse over and over again, photographing and filming her. When decomposition began, he realized he couldn't keep her there any longer. He then dismembered her remains, concealing her torso in a cemetery and her head amongst the hills, keeping her hands and later consuming them.
In the weeks that followed, Miyazaki's behavior grew even more disturbing. He would take the body parts he kept and lay them beside him at night. He didn't just revisit his crimes in memory, he returned to them physically, again and again, as if trying to relive what he had done. A year after murdering Ayako Nomoto, Miyazaki went hunting again. He spotted 2 young girls playing in a park and managed to coax one of them away. It was a pattern he knew well by now. Separate a child from her friends, lead her somewhere isolated, and make sure she never returned. But this time there was a variable he hadn't accounted for. The girl's father was watching, and from a distance he saw his daughter walking off with a stranger. An instinct took over. He ran toward them, closing the gap fast, and before Miyazaki could react, the father was on him, dragging him away from the child and beating him to the ground. Miyazaki managed to break free and fled, slipping out of the man's grasp for the moment. But the father wasn't finished. He called the police. The officers arrived quickly and began searching the area for the man described to them. And then, an hour later, Miyazaki made a mistake so reckless it defied belief. He came back. He returned to the park to retrieve his car, completely unaware or unconcerned that police were still there. The girl's father saw him immediately and pointed him out. This time, there was no escape. Officers arrested him on the spot. When police searched his home, they found something far worse than they had expected. Miyazaki had documented everything. He had photographs and videotapes of his victims, cataloging his crimes in a way that suggested he had no real fear of being caught. But even more disturbingly, they found remains. The hands and feet of Marikono, along with other pieces of his victims, were hidden inside his wardrobe. There was no question about who had been taking children from Itsukaichi. The only question now was what to do with them. And the media wasted no time giving him a name: the Otaku Killer.
It was a label born from the stacks of horror manga and violent anime found in his apartment. Whether those interests had anything to do with his crimes was, and still is, debated. But nuance didn't matter. The public needed a villain, and Miyazaki fit the role with terrifying ease. In court, he tried to slip out of responsibility. He claimed he wasn't the one who committed the murders. His alter ego was, a figure he called Ratman. He leaned hard into the idea of mental illness, suggesting he suffered from multiple personality disorder. For a moment, it created hesitation. Some experts wondered if there was any truth to his claims. The courts were unmoved. Chief Justice Tokiyasu later summarized the case with chilling clarity. The atrocious murder of 4 girls to satisfy his sexual desire leaves no room for leniency. Miyazaki was sentenced to death. In Japan, the wait between sentencing and execution is often long, 8 years on average, sometimes more if appeals drag on. Miyazaki tried. He filed appeal after appeal, but each one was rejected with unusual speed. The system that had once hesitated now showed no patience for him at all. Then on June 17, 2008, it ended. Without warning, prison officials removed Miyazaki from his cell and carried out his execution by hanging in a Tokyo detention center. There was no media spectacle, no last-minute legal maneuvering, no public countdown. His death unfolded quietly, almost clinically, an abrupt conclusion to a life defined by chaos and cruelty. In the end, the man who had terrorized families and shaken a nation slipped out of the world without none of the attention he once commanded. A silent exit starkly at odds with the devastation he left behind. Miyazaki's execution closed one of Japan's darkest chapters, but the world has never been short on men whose violence defies easy explanation, and sometimes that violence takes a shape no one expects.
Half a world away, another killer was carving out his own legend. A man the media would later call the real-life Dexter. His name was Pedro Rodrigues Filho, and unlike most serial killers, he didn't stalk the innocent. He hunted the people he believed deserved to die, suspected murderers, rapists, and criminals. Pedro Rodrigues Filho would later be described as the perfect psychopath, a label earned not just from the number of people he killed, but from the unusual nature of his targets. Over the course of his life, Pedro was responsible for at least 70 murders. 10 of them committed before he turned 18. And like many serial killers, he claimed the real number was even higher. What set him apart was who he chose to kill. According to Pedro himself, he targeted drug dealers, rapists, and murderers, people he believed had harmed others and deserved retribution. And by his own account, he eliminated more than 100 criminals, insisting he never killed anyone he considered innocent. It was a narrative he leaned into heavily, casting himself not as a predator, but as a vigilante.
Much like the fictional character Dexter, Pedro saw his violence as a form of justice. The courts, of course, saw something very different. Despite the scale of his violence, Pedro spent far less time behind bars than most people imagine. He ultimately served 34 years for more than 70 murders he committed, then another 7 years, from 2011 to 2018, for crimes he carried out while already incarcerated. And when he finally walked free, his story took a turn no one could have predicted. He reinvented himself as a YouTuber, using his channel to warn others against the very life he once embraced. But to understand how he became one of Brazil's most notorious killers, you have to go back to the beginning.
Pedro's life was marked by violence before he ever took a life himself. Born in 1954 in Brazil, he entered the world with a fractured skull, an injury caused not by accident, but by his father beating his mother while she was pregnant. From the moment he drew his first breath, the trajectory of his life was already bent toward brutality. Pedro was just 14 the first time he killed a man. His target was the deputy mayor of Santa Rita, the official who had fired Pedro's father, a school security guard, after accusing him of stealing food from the cafeteria. Armed with his father's shotgun, Pedro walked into the town hall and shot the deputy mayor in retaliation. Then he went after the man he believed was the real thief. The security guard who had replaced his father was next. Now a wanted teenager, Pedro fled. Instead of disappearing into anonymity, his violence escalated. He began robbing drug dens and killing the dealers he encountered, carving out a reputation that spread quickly through the region. The media eventually gave him a name, Pedrinho Matador, a vigilante who claimed to be cleaning the streets one criminal at a time.
During this period, Pedro did something unexpected for a man already steeped in violence. He fell in love. Her name was Maria Olympia. The two moved in together, and before long she became pregnant. But their brief attempt at a normal life ended abruptly. A local gang leader, hoping to strike back at Pedro, murdered her. For Pedro, grief immediately transformed into vengeance. He began hunting down anyone connected to Olympia's death. One by one, he tracked them, interrogated them, and killed them, determined to reach the man who had taken her life. By the time he was done, every member of the gang responsible for her murder was dead. To Pedro, this wasn't chaos. It was justice, and it cemented the reputation he would carry for the rest of his life. Pedro's desire for vengeance didn't end with the gang that killed his partner. It found a new and far more personal target when his father murdered his mother with a machete. Both men eventually landed in the same prison, and Pedro began planning the revenge he believed he owed her. He said, "I killed my father in prison. I had promised revenge on my mother's coffin." He described the moment with chilling clarity. He went to his father's cell, stabbed him 22 times, and then mutilated the body in a final act of retribution. But Pedro's violence behind bars didn't begin there. Years earlier, on May 24th, 1973, he was being transported to prison in a police car with 2 other inmates, one of them a convicted rapist. By the time officers opened the door at their destination, the rapist was dead. Pedro had killed him during the ride. To him, these acts weren't crimes. They were justice. His justice, delivered without hesitation. And now they were bringing him into a building filled with other convicts.
According to the Toronto Sun, Pedro killed at least 47 fellow inmates during his time behind bars, murders that made up the majority of his known body count. By his own account, every one of those men deserved to die. That belief wasn't a performance for the media, it was the code he lived by. Pedro often insisted he never killed an innocent person. Even the tattoo across his arm, saying, "I kill for pleasure," didn't tell the whole story. He claimed the pleasure wasn't in the act itself, but in the anger, the righteousness, the sense of vengeance he felt toward those he believed had harmed others. And in his mind, he wasn't a monster. He was an executioner. Though Pedro was originally sentenced to 128 years in prison, the murders he committed behind bars pushed that total to more than 400. But under Brazilian law at the time, no one could serve more than 30 years. Later increased to 40. In the end, Pedro served only 4 additional years for the killings he carried out in prison. So in 2007, he walked out a free man and took a job as a night watchman. By then, he was already notorious across Brazil, not just for the sheer number of people he had killed, but for the type of people he targeted. His victims were almost always criminals themselves, a pattern that fed the myth of Pedrinho Matador as a vigilante rather than a predator. After his release, he leaned into that image. He spoke openly about his crimes, positioned himself as an anti-crime advocate, and even gained a kind of celebrity. His story reportedly helped inspire the Showtime series Dexter, which centered on a serial killer who targeted other violent offenders. But trouble found him again. In 2011, Pedro was arrested once more, not for murder, but for threatening others, illegal possession of weapons, and participating in prison riots. This time, the charges were far less severe. He served his sentence, behaved well, and was released again in 2018. A man who had once filled prisons with fear was now walking free for the second time. Free again, Pedro made a curious pivot. He launched a YouTube channel and began using his own life as a warning. He spoke openly about his crimes, about his years in prison, and the violence that had defined him, urging viewers, especially young people, to avoid the path he had taken. For a man once feared across Brazil, it was an unexpected transformation. But Pedro's story ended abruptly on March 5th, 2023. Outside a family member's home in Sao Paulo, he was ambushed. According to the Mirror, the 68-year-old was found with his throat slashed and multiple gunshot wounds. the attackers fleeing in a black car. Police later located the abandoned vehicle and a cache of ammunition nearby. Before leaving the scene, the assailants reportedly told Pedro's relative, "It's nothing to do with you. Take your daughter and go inside." It's unknown who ordered the killings of Pedrino Matador. A man who spent his life hunting others was in the end hunted himself.
When you look at Tsutomu Miyazaki and Pedro Rodrigues Filho side by side, you're staring at two very different faces of human darkness. One hunted innocents. The other hunted those he believed had forfeited theirs. One shattered families who had done nothing but trusted the world around them. The other stepped into the void where justice had failed and delivered his own brutal version of balance. And yet, for all their differences, both men remind us of the same truth. Violence never exists in a vacuum. It ripples outward. It reshapes the people who survive it. It leaves scars on families, on communities, on entire nations. Miyazaki's legacy is pure devastation, a reminder of how fragile safety can be, how quickly a single person's cruelty can unravel the lives of the innocent. Pedro's legacy is more complicated. Some saw him as a monster, others saw him as a necessary force in a world where the system often looked the other way. He shortened sentences that courts never handed down. He delivered consequences that many victims' families never received. But even when violence feels righteous, it still leaves blood on the ground. It still takes a toll. It still shapes a life in ways that can never be undone. Both men died far from the chaos they created, one quietly behind prison walls, the other violently on the street he thought he knew. Their endings couldn't have been more different, but they converge on the same point. No matter the motive, no matter the target, a life built on violence always circles back to it. And maybe that's the lesson these stories leave behind. Justice without humanity becomes cruelty. Cruelty without consequence becomes terror. And somewhere between those extremes, ordinary people are left to rebuild, to grieve, to make sense of the senseless. Because in the end, the measure of a society isn't found in the monsters it produces, or even the vigilantes who rise in their shadow. It's found in the people who refuse to let violence define them, in the families who carry on, in the communities that heal, in the quiet insistence that life, even after horror, can still move forward.